What are the ramifications of the federal government's vicious attacks on free speech? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you. It's good to be with our viewers and listeners in these troubling times.
Well, they are troubling, Richard, and one of the most troubling aspects of the times in which we're living is the assault on freedom of speech. Now, we know that governments are going to do this. I mean, our ancestors understood that governments were going to attack free speech. That was why they enacted the First Amendment. I mean, the First Amendment is essentially an acknowledgement that the federal government is going to attract the kind of people that are going to suppress dissent, criticism of the government. And so our ancestors said, we want that document amended immediately after ratification, just to send a message that we understand that government attracts these kind of people, and you don't have that authority. And of course, that's why they made the judicial branch of government to enforce that and to enforce the rest of the restrictions in the Bill of Rights, to enforce the limited government powers in the Constitution. So it shouldn't be as any surprise, but Richard, it's important that we call these people out. Now, I just read in the paper that there's a trial going on in Florida, I think it's in Tampa, where the feds are prosecuting a group of people, I think it's 3 people, who were socialists. And they're part of a self-described, self-labeled socialist organization, really obscure. I mean, I've never heard of them. They appear to be very small, and they've got a political action part of their socialist program. And they've been advocating this group for 50 years. One of the guys on trial is in his 80s. A woman on trial is in her late 70s, 78 or something like that. And they're going after them because they didn't register as agents for the Russian government. Oh, here we go. You know, Russia, the Russians are coming to get us. And it turns out that what these people were doing was coordinating a lot of their pro-socialist efforts with some Russian guy that the government says was part of the Russian government, and that the Russian government was helping fund their activities. Now, what were their activities? You know, criticizing the U.S. government in Ukraine, criticizing the exclusion of Russia from the Olympics, criticizing the imperialist policy of the U.S. government. And that one woman apparently was helped in this organization to run for city council in some town, Tampa or something there in Florida. She got 18% of the vote. Didn't quite make it, but boy, they were clear. The Russians were clearly trying to influence the city council election. This is unbelievable, Richard. I mean, I feel like I'm in the midst of the Cold War again. The Russians, the Russians, the Russians. This is the official enemy of the American people. Okay, they've lost Afghanistan. Remember when they were killing all those people in Afghanistan? They're not killing any, masses of people in Iraq anymore. So their war on terrorism is fizzling. They don't have this big giant Muslim Islamic terrorist threat that they kept everybody scared with after they lost Russia as their official enemy in the Cold War. But they've revitalized their official enemy with Russia. And to go after people because they didn't register as Russian agents is unbelievable. Now, this law that they're going after them on, it stretches all the way back to 1938 under the regime of Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, this is the guy that converted the whole federal government to a welfare state without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. This is a guy that nationalized gold, made it a felony offense to own gold, without a constitutional amendment. The Constitution calls for gold coins and silver coins as the official money. He converted the whole system to a paper money standard, and he exercised other dictatorial policies And then he enacts this law in 1938. Why? Because the Nazis were threatening to influence Americans in a German direction. Well, and so that's what they've carried forth. The Russians are going to influence Americans. Well, what does that say? That the American is a to me, it's a total indictment of the public school system, the public government school system, okay? Because what they're saying is that Americans are so weak-minded, their minds are so malleable and so weak and formative, no matter how old they are, that those Russians are going to come over and influence their mindsets. They're going to be pro-Russians, Richard. Oh my gosh, we're going to be Russians or communists or Reds, whatever the term was used during the Cold War. I mean, it's just all over again, the old Cold War. They've got their official enemy, Russia or China. China's another one. Oddly enough, they don't have Vietnam as an official enemy, which is kind of weird. You know, I don't see anybody being prosecuted for not registering with the Vietnamese government because the Vietnam is they're communists, but they're not considered an official enemy. So it's unbelievable to me that this is what's going on in America today. The federal government trying and the defendants in this case are rightly pointing out this is just an attack on free speech. They want to silence dissent. They want to silence any criticisms of the federal government, especially with respect to Russia. That Russia is the official enemy. You get on board if you know what's good for you, or we're going to come after you for failing to register. Now, let me make one final point here. It's not against the law to work for the Russian government. Interestingly enough, they haven't made that a crime yet, or to serve as a lobbyist or an influencer or to help the Russian government influence Americans. That's not a criminal offense. It's that you need to register that you are operating in this capacity so that people can be aware that you're influencing them and molding their minds in a red, communist, or Russian direction. This is absolutely ludicrous, Richard. And interestingly enough, the Russian government has copied the same registration law. So when the prosecutor tells the jury, you know, this is designed to protect America and our free society, our democratic society, he doesn't tell them that they do the same thing in Russia. And it gives you kind of an idea of this mindset that we have to be totalitarian and authoritarian in order to fight the totalitarians and the authoritarians. What do you think?
Well, I think we should be reminded also of the hypocrisy in all this. Going back to the immediate post-World War II period in Europe, late 40s and throughout the 50s, actually into the 60s and 70s, but certainly in the 50s and 60s, there was a quarterly popular scholarly publication called Encounter magazine. It was funded by a European-based and what we now call an NGO, a nonprofit group, nonprofit organization. They had some of the most prestigious European intellectuals, authors, writers writing for them. I've gone back and read many of their issues, and in fact, a lot of interesting pieces. I'll even say some of them are still timely if you're interested in particularly freedom ideas or cultural ideas. But what was hidden throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s is who funded this. Was it an independent organization just expressing ideas? No, it was the CIA. They approached they not only funded the publication as a magazine, but they approached authors and offered to pay authors money to make contributions to the publication with only one request. Don't say who contacted you or where the money came from to pay you the equivalent of the honorarium for writing the piece. Was that not, and why did the US government do this? And why didn't they come out in front and do this? Well, you know, they didn't want to seem that it was American propaganda, that it was America attempting to influence popular and common and intellectual opinion in Europe. It wanted to be as if the Europeans are concerned with communism. The Europeans are concerned with the drift towards the left. The Europeans are concerned with the danger of totalitarianism. But it was the CIA financially and through trying to influence who wrote for it, pulling the strings. Now, was that not America using clandestinely taxpayer funds to try to influence the direction of European politics? The hypocrisy. How many candidates or political movements have the US government funneled money to try to get people elected? Or how many groups have they funded and supported surreptitiously to finance a coup d'etat or a civil war to overthrow a political party and a government of which they disapproved? And yet now they say, well, you know, some people might have appeared on that Russian television station, RT, Russian television,
Russia Today.
Russia Today, or they might be espousing views that serve the Russian point of view, and therefore they are either explicitly or implicitly towing a Russian line. The same way it would be talked about, you know, the fifth columnist towing the Soviet line during the Cold War, the useful idiot serving the Kremlin. And this is an attempt to intimidate and censor what people say. The worst censorship is when people self-censor. If I express this point of view, if I articulate this perspective, do I make the case for this policy position or this view of how America as a country should interact with the rest of the world, that I might be accused or suspected of or be open to an investigation or a search warrant to go through my papers in person in my home? What happens to people's willingness to speak out and articulate what they really think? Now, that doesn't mean you agree with them. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, they're holding the right point of view. But as you were suggesting, the idea of freedom of speech is that there is no limit on this. That just because either the government or pressure groups, private interests don't like someone's speech, that they can use the power of the state to suppress it, is inherently opposite of the very principle, as you were saying in the First Amendment. Congress may pass no law. 99% of the people in the United States may disapprove of the opinion that one person articulates, but Congress may pass no law. They cannot pressure their congressional representatives to pass legislation to silence even that one person. That is absolute freedom of speech. And it doesn't matter whether you're paying yourself to articulate these views in some printed or verbal way. It doesn't matter if you get fellow Americans informally or through some organization to finance your ability to articulate these views in a written or spoken way. And in principle, it doesn't involve whether the funding is coming from private individuals or even a government, given how much the US government has done this and continues to do this. This is merely a way of shutting the opinions that the powers that be, the political establishment, the party in power, the ideologues with their own agenda concerning the United States want to further by suppressing anyone who will articulate or present a position in opposition to them and who might be persuasive in influencing others to think differently than the government wants them to.
Yeah, when you were talking about the U.S. government's actions, what was coming to my mind was Chile. That in the 1970 election, that was the election that Allende won, Salvador Allende, who the U.S. government was strongly opposed to because, like those defendants in Florida, he was a socialist and therefore posed a grave threat to U.S. national security. Well, it turns out that Allende had been defeated some 6 years before in the presidential election, in which the CIA was, I mean, they might as well have been just a independent political party there, secret political party, because they were funneling, I forget how much money, I think millions of dollars into the presidential campaign. to help Allende's opponent. And then when 1970 comes along, they were doing the same thing. And they were using private American corporations down there to do what? Expound propaganda that the U.S. government wanted to flood the Chilean people with to influence them. And then came the coup that you were referring to in '73, when nothing had worked. They tried to bribe the members of the Chilean Congress, and that hadn't worked. They had kidnapped and murdered the head of the Chilean armed forces, a man of tremendous integrity named Rene Schneider. That didn't work. So they finally just turned to a coup. And they're over here saying, we've got to protect America from those Russians. Well, Richard, let me just outline exactly how I believe a free society operates. In a free society, you don't have this registration law. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that Russia has this registration law. It's Russia. It's a long tradition of authoritarianism. But for the United States to have a registration law, whether it's about what you're expounding or who you're working for, that's incredible. As far as I'm concerned, any regime in the world's got the right to hire whomever they want and expound any views they want, and that's Russia, China, North Korea, Vietnam. The First Amendment doesn't limit the freedom of speech to American citizens. Freedom of speech is a right that adheres to everyone. So as far as I'm concerned, every regime in the world, expound whatever views you want, hire whoever you want, and get rid of this authoritarian-like Roosevelt-era registration law. I mean, to me, the fact that a registration law like that exists in the United States is phenomenal. And let me say something else about the official enemies. You know, this is all about Russia. They need an official enemy, Richard. That's what justifies the national security state. If you don't have official enemies, how do you keep people afraid and agitated? And so after they've lost the terrorism threat, they've now returned to Russia as the official enemy. But I'm reminded of Muhammad Ali, who they went after. And Ali, of course, had said, I'm not going to comply with your conscription law, your draft law. They were drafting him to go fight in that war in Vietnam, which of course was an undeclared war, an illegal war. But again, with this mindset of, oh, we got to stop the Reds or the dominoes are going to fall and they're going to be all of a sudden coming over here and take the United States. But I think they were really angry at Muhammad Ali, not just because he resisted the draft, because of what he said. He said, you know, I got no problems with those Viet Cong. You know, they had never called him an N-word, or they never had him live in a segregated society, and he didn't have anything against them. I think that infuriated the Pentagon, the CIA, the whole national security establishment, because when they name an official enemy, you get on board with that official enemy. And their official enemy at that time was the Vietnamese Reds and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And for a black man, especially, to make this pronouncement that he's got nothing against this official enemy, I think it absolutely infuriated him. And I think when Martin Luther King joined up with Muhammad Ali and started opposing the war, I think that marked him for a shorter life as well. So, you know, what do we do, Richard? And I think the only thing you can do is call these people out for what they are and what they're doing. Because clearly, you know, you're not going to stop that criminal prosecution. I'm really hoping the jury sees through this. One guy is defending himself. I'm not sure how smart that is, but there are lawyers representing the other two. And the greatest thing in the world would be to see that jury come back with a not guilty verdict.
Yeah, it's also important to point out the danger in our society today concerning this, is that it's not as if it's the left versus the right, the conservative versus the modern day liberals, or so on. There have been many times over the last many decades that you might have the Democrats or the left holding positions that are egregious from a free market point of view, and conservatives might at least give some lip service and rationalize some of the free market arguments as to why that was bad, and vice versa on civil liberties. Conservatives would often seem bad from a classic liberal libertarian point of view on a variety of civil liberty issues, and those on the left or among the Democrats or the progressives would somehow at least be articulating a more First Amendment perspective. But the danger what we have today, compared to at least one, for political purposes, at least gave lip service to the more freedom perspective, however inconsistent and incomplete it might have been. Today, both parties, both conservatives and progressives, believe in this. They both, for their own reasons, with their own emphases of argumentation, believe that there need to be restrictions, confinements, and prohibitions on the form and the type and the setting of the use of freedom of speech. In that sense, both political parties are actively and articulately and explicitly opposing a fundamental element of the First Amendment of the US Constitution, and therefore joining forces, if you will, in a coalition of a destruction of a fundamental element of human liberty in this country.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, and it's on foreign policy. They're all on the same page now, supporting the what NATO did with respect to provoking Russia into attacking Ukraine. I mean, it really is a war between the United States and Russia, and the agent for the United States is the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian government. They're just the agent, but it's the Pentagon. This is clearly a Pentagon-run show. And then both parties are on board with that. And you see it with respect to speech issues, civil liberties. They're all on the same page. The only ones really that are speaking out against the stuff, the Ukraine intervention, foreign interventionism in general, are the libertarians. But they're doing their best to shut us down too, Richard. It's not just the major parties, it's the mainstream media too. How often do you see our perspective, the libertarian perspective, published in the mainstream media? New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Hardly ever. They know who's in control here. They know what's going on. They're not dumb. When the government decides to target a newspaper or a radio station or whatever, I mean, everybody knows the power of the government. And so it's like what you were saying earlier, you start to self-censor. You don't accept that op-ed from that libertarian. It's just not worth it. It's not worth going down that road. And so what happened, as you know, over the last, 15 years or so, this radio network called RT, as you mentioned earlier, Russia Today, they changed their name to RT. They were starting to publish libertarian perspectives on foreign policy. Now, obviously, they have their own agenda there. They're trying to advance the interests of the Russian government, but nonetheless, they were the only ones really providing an outlet for libertarian and classical liberal conservative viewpoints. There were shows there by libertarians and conservatives on RT. I mean, like regular broadcast shows, like on the major networks, and they were publishing op-eds, they were having guests there, and it had to have infuriated the US government because all of a sudden libertarians had an outlet, and they were getting their perspectives expounded upon there. Well, that only lasted a certain amount of time. They've run RT out of the country. They started targeting them. And they said that they needed to register. They were running afoul of this Roosevelt era registration law, and the ultimate outcome is RT said, "See you later," and which to me is a shame. When you see a country that purports to stand for freedom and freedom of speech running out at people because you don't like their perspective and you don't like their views, that's really problematic. And now the feds are saying we're investigating people who were working for RT, getting paid to run these programs and so forth. Well, there's your self-censorship. I mean, who's gonna want to talk about these kind of things for fear of what the government's going to do to target them? I mean, it's like a gray cloud that is falling on America, Richard. And it's not just economics, it's also civil liberties and free speech.
Yes, this is a general counter-revolution against the principles and practice of liberty in all of its facets, economic, social, personal. It is an attempt to cut down, in some cases, totally eliminate, and certainly straitjacket and inhibit the discussing, the articulation, the debating of a variety of points of views. Let's take Robert Kennedy Jr. as a case. I've seen him on YouTube on some shows that people can find out. I'm not going to name them, but they're known if you're a conservative or a libertarian, in which, for example, he just recently was articulating two things. One was how he believes that it is the United States government that is fundamentally the force that has created the circumstance that has led to this Russian invasion of Ukraine. He articulated correctly, and in my view, that in the early 1990s, a variety of both European and American members of the political establishment made it clear to first Gorbachev and then Yeltsin's government that if the Soviets were to withdraw from East Germany, so Germany can unify, and then withdrew their forces from the rest of what was called the captive nations of Eastern Europe, but was conquered and made into an empire of the Soviet Union by Stalin, that the United States would not attempt to move NATO forward, that those countries could be free in the sense free trade and democratic governments, but they would not be brought into the network of the NATO military alliance. And certainly that was the case with Ukraine as well. But with the articulation by the US and other NATO countries, and the articulation by those who had political positions in Ukraine, that the goal was, whether today, tomorrow, or 5 years from now, that Ukraine should itself also be a part of NATO. This set the stage for the Russians viewing this as a threat to their national security. Now, and Robert Kennedy has articulated this. Now, is he an agent for Putin's government? Should he be subject to an investigation to see whether he has ever received any money directly or indirectly, surreptitiously or not, from some sources that could be linked and tied to the Russian government? That would be the issue in this. So who would be free of this? And what basis of demonstration of this? These are serious matters, because basically to articulate the idea that the United States may have had a leading hand or fundamental policy ingredient in creating the conditions under which Putin decided he viewed it in Russia's interest to invade Ukraine, that now means that everybody can be shut up. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I happen to believe this myself, that the United States instigated much of what has created the conditions for this Russian-Ukrainian war. But if I was a libertarian in Russia and Putin was articulating both the policies and the implementation of the policies that he's had, as a Russian libertarian, I would say, Putin, it's not your business what other countries do. And whether you like it or not, you shouldn't be saying that another country can or cannot belong to a military alliance. And it is against libertarian principles, just because you don't like the policies of a neighboring government, that you invade it, causing death and destruction to now tens of thousands of people, including your own soldiers and your own civilians. And that you should be non-interventionist regardless of what other countries do. But it doesn't change the fact that as far as Putin is concerned, okay, as far as Putin is concerned, and he's the head of the government with his own mindset, he viewed the approaching attempt to make Ukraine a part of the NATO alliance a threat of the Russian national interest as he was defining it. And from his point of view, his mindset, whether I as a libertarian would agree with it or not, he concluded that his only recourse was to undertake a military action to prevent this from occurring. If the US had not pushed this, and Ukraine had maintained a clear and articulate neutral position, there might not have been a war that is now going on into its third year. But to even articulate this, to say that the US was part of the problem and not the solution, immediately makes you viewed as an enemy of the state, because you're articulating a point of view not only in opposed to the US government, but a point of view that another government holds that the US government doesn't like.
Yeah, that's what you're not supposed to do. And they knew this, Richard. They knew, and NATO with the Pentagon, the CIA, they knew this as they were moving east. And you're right. Putin should have been a libertarian and said, well, okay, you have a right to do this. Okay, fine. But they knew he would not react that way. They knew he was not a libertarian. And you know how they knew it? Because Putin told them. That was one reason. Putin said, stop. That's our red line here. And the second reason they knew it is because they knew that that's how they react if Russia puts missiles and troops in Cuba. I mean, that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. Russia said, we got a right to do this. Cuba says we have a right to do this. It's independent countries. We're putting our missiles here on invitation of the Cubans. What's the problem? And Kennedy's position, the US government's position is, we're not talking about what you have a right to do. We're talking as a practical matter, we're not going to let nuclear missiles be positioned 90 miles from American shores. And so that's the Russian mindset too. And they knew that when they kept moving eastward. And the third reason they knew it is because they had set this trap before in Afghanistan in 1979, when it was, I think it was Brzezinski that later said, we lured the Soviets into attacking Afghanistan. We laid the trap for them. We wanted to give them their own Vietnam. Why? To degrade them. And what do they mean by degrading? Killing Russian troops. And that's what this is all about, Richard. All these tens of thousands of Russian troops that are dying there. In the minds of the US officials, this is a good thing. This is degrading Russia. This is hurting Putin. This is perverted. This is absolutely perverted. But this is what they're trying to shut down, Richard. They want everybody to buy into this official mindset that, oh, the Russians are coming to get us. Oh, no, they can't even conquer Ukraine. They can't even break through the lines in Ukraine, but they're going to take over all of Western Europe. They're going to cross the ocean. They're going to invade and conquer the United States. And that's why we've got to have this $1 trillion budget for the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, and continue increasing it no matter how much it leads toward the bankruptcy of this country.
But the only way to prevent this or try to slow it down or arouse in a public opinion that would challenge it is if we have the protection and the security of the freedom of speech. Because how else can this policy be challenged, questioned, brought to a higher public consciousness if you can't have the liberty to say what you believe? And fine, I hold these views as a libertarian. I hold a lot of views as a libertarian. I don't believe in the welfare state. I don't believe in government intervention or regulation. I don't believe in subsidies to business. I don't believe in government bestowed monopolies. I don't believe in tariffs. I don't believe in any of this that the government does, okay? But I don't try to censor those who disagree with me. Someone holds the more mainstream view that this is the role and the duty and the responsibility of government to intervene and regulate in this fashion, and that they think that there are good results from them and it's consistent with the American way, fine. I'm willing to argue and debate this. I may win or I might lose, depending upon the persuasiveness of that person's argument relative to my own. Fine, that's called open discourse. It's called the market of ideas, right? In which there's a competition of alternative views that are expressed, discussed, debated, and others are listening into them and making up their own minds about it. But if we don't have that, then there is no policy other than the government's policy, and we become victims and slaves to it.
Yeah, and that's what we're about here at FFF. That's what we've been doing for 34 years, Richard. speaking out against the tyranny, not just with respect to economics, not just with respect to the militarism of American society, the immigration controls, the drug war, the foreign coups, the interventions, but also arguing fervently for civil liberties. You recall our very first year, we devoted an entire issue of our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, to the importance of civil liberties.
Oh, yes.
And that's what we will continue doing. And in that respect, I want to thank all of you that have supported our mid-year fundraising drive, and those of you who have supported us throughout these years, 34 years. You've helped us continue doing what we do, and that's speaking the truth to power. And thank you very much for doing that.
And I'll just add to that, that it is the merit of the degree to which we still have an element of a free society, that people have the latitude and liberty and personal choice to decide what causes and ideas they wish to support, and that liberty has enabled, through the kindness and generosity, as you were just saying, of contributors, to help us present that case for freedom in an arena of dark clouds over the horizon.
On that eloquent note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of our efforts here at FFF. Thank you for all you've done for us for the 34 years of our existence. And Richard, I really enjoyed this particular conversation. I enjoy all of them, but I especially enjoyed this one. And I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.